When I saw the delivery boy standing at the corner of our building, holding a package that clearly wasn't for us, my heart skipped a beat, not out of fear or guilt, but from something far worse, recognition. It was that same face I had tried to erase from my dreams for weeks now. He didn't see me at first. I was behind the curtain, clutching a half-empty glass of water like it was some kind of fragile anchor to the ordinary. I thought I'd hidden everything well, every look, every pause, every gesture that had ever lingered too long. I had told myself it was harmless. A game. A breeze passing through the window on a still day. But now, standing there with nothing but air and cracked glass between us, I understood this was no breeze. It was a storm I had let in with my own hands. My chest tightened as his gaze rose, almost instinctively, to the window. My fingers moved too late. Our eyes met. He saw me. I saw him. And we both knew everything. My hand trembled as I set the glass back on the sill, and in that one small moment, it all came flooding back, the silence of my house, the numbness in my skin, the way I had once laughed when he said, "You don't look like you belong here." Maybe I didn't. Maybe I never did. But before I can make sense of how I got to this moment, let me take you back to where it all began. Before I tell you the secret I've tried so hard to bury, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and answer this. Have you ever buried something so deep inside that even you started to believe it never happened? I never imagined a life where silence could be louder than words, but that was what my days had become. Silence between walls, silence between breaths, and, most piercing of all, the silence between my husband and me. We weren't unhappy. That's the strange part. We weren't fighting, cheating, or breaking things in the kitchen. We simply faded. Like wallpaper left too long in the sun. He still brought groceries. Still refilled my teacup when it got low. Still said goodnight, sometimes even kissed my forehead. But the way he touched me, it wasn't touching anymore. It was remembering. Like he was trying to hold on to a memory, not a person. I spent most mornings alone in the kitchen, a ceramic mug warming my palms, my mind wandering nowhere in particular. I had become a woman who studied shadows on the floor. Watched birds. Waited for sounds. One Thursday, while watering the dusty plants near the window, I noticed how the glass trembled ever so slightly with each truck that passed below. There was something calming about the rhythm of that life outside, people moving, things arriving, doors opening. It was then I saw him the first time. The delivery boy. Maybe 20, maybe less. Lean. Alert. His shirt clung slightly to his chest where sweat had drawn a map. He buzzed, smiled faintly when I opened the door, and handed me a parcel. It wasn't even for me, it was for the neighbor. But I signed anyway. That night, while my husband sat watching a documentary about fishing boats, I found myself wondering what that boy listened to in his headphones. What scent his shirt carried. Whether he had someone waiting for him. The next day, I opened the window just a bit wider. I placed a glass of water on the ledge, not for any reason, really. It was hot. I was tired. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to see him again. Nothing happened for 2 days. Then on Sunday, a buzz. I didn't order anything. When I opened the door, he stood there again. This time, the parcel was indeed for me, tea bags I had forgotten I'd ordered 2 weeks prior. He said, "I thought this looked like your kind of thing." I frowned. "How do you know what my kind of thing is?" He shrugged. "Guess I don't. Just a hunch." That night, I thought about the way his eyes paused for half a second too long. I thought about the way his voice didn't match his age. How quiet it was. Not shy, measured. My husband asked if I'd like to go for a walk. I said I was tired. Truth was, I didn't want the sound of shoes next to mine that no longer meant anything. The next morning, I placed the glass on the sill again. Not full. Just a third of the way, something in between a call and a hesitation. I began to pay attention to time. 11:15, that's when he usually came. Some days he didn't. Others, he passed the building and didn't stop. On those days, I felt something close to relief, like a storm had skirted my town. But on the days he did come, I noticed my body moved before my thoughts. I brushed my hair. Changed into a skirt. Applied lip balm I hadn't touched in years. We never spoke more than a few lines. But our silences were different. Not voids, currents. One day, while dusting the bookshelves, I found an old photograph from when my husband and I had just married. I looked at it for a long time, searching for the heat we once had. We had loved each other. I knew we had. But time was a thief, and it had stolen something neither of us knew how to recover. That evening, he came home late. Said traffic had been terrible. Kissed me on the forehead and went straight to bed. I sat at the kitchen table long after the lights were out, watching the condensation drip slowly down the outside of the glass on the windowsill. I wanted something to happen. Something to jolt me awake. I didn't care what anymore. And so, the next time I saw the delivery boy walking past the building, I opened the window just a little wider. My hand shook as I picked up the glass and tilted it toward the street, catching the light like a quiet signal. He looked up. And everything I had buried in routine, in marriage, in silence, suddenly felt alive again. He didn't stop walking right away. He looked up at the window, saw me, paused only for a beat, and then kept going as if he hadn't seen anything at all. I remained frozen behind the glass, the tips of my fingers still touching the edge of the water glass like a pianist hesitating before a note. I wasn't sure if I felt humiliated or liberated. Maybe both. Maybe neither. My thoughts scattered in all directions and yet failed to form anything coherent. I didn't move until the street was completely empty again. That evening, I went through the motions of my usual routine. Dinner was already simmering by the time my husband returned. I heard his keys before he even opened the door, that soft metallic clink I could recognize even in my sleep. He came in quietly, his face weary, the lines around his mouth deeper than they had been in the morning. I watched him take off his shoes, fold his jacket over the back of the chair, and pour himself a glass of water without saying a word. We ate in silence, the only sounds coming from the clink of utensils and the occasional scrape of plate on wood. He asked how my day was, and I told him it was fine. That was the truth, nothing extraordinary had happened. But something had shifted, and I felt its weight. Later that night, after he had gone to bed, I stood in front of the mirror for the longest time. The hallway light behind me cast my reflection in soft yellow, like an old photograph. I leaned in close, tracing the small lines at the corners of my eyes, the tired look in my gaze that hadn't always been there. I wasn't sad. But I wasn't whole either. There was something hollow about the way I turned off the lights, as though the darkness was a better mirror than the glass. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. My husband was already gone. I wandered into the kitchen, still barefoot, and opened the window out of instinct. The air was still cool, with a trace of wetness, as though it had rained somewhere nearby. I placed the glass of water on the sill again, but this time I didn't think of it as a signal. It was just a habit now. Or maybe an invitation I didn't expect anyone to accept. At exactly 11:15, the buzz came. My pulse didn't rise. I didn't feel flushed or breathless. Just aware. I opened the door, and there he was, box in hand, expression unreadable. "You again," I said, keeping my voice light. "I guess so," he replied. He handed me the package, tea again, a different kind. I hadn't ordered it. I looked at the label. It had my name. My address. But the sender was unfamiliar. I opened my mouth to question it but closed it again. He tilted his head slightly, as if waiting for me to speak. But I didn't. There was nothing to say. He nodded and turned to leave. I watched him go, the soft thud of his steps against the stairs fading. That evening, I cooked something different, an old recipe I hadn't made in years. My husband noticed. "This smells like something you made when we were in Paris," he said. I nodded. "It is." He smiled, almost surprised. "I forgot you still remembered that trip." I didn't answer. We ate. Talked about nothing. The television murmured in the background. At one point, he reached for my hand. I let him hold it. His skin was dry and warm. Familiar. Solid. But I was no longer sure if that was enough. That night, I dreamed of a hallway lined with doors. I opened one after another, but each room inside was empty. Clean. Polished. Sterile. When I finally opened the last one, the delivery boy stood there, not smiling, not moving. He said nothing. Neither did I. But I woke with the taste of something unsaid lingering on my tongue. The next day, I didn't place the glass. I didn't open the window. But I still stood near it. Waited. Watched. And at 11:15, nothing happened. By noon, I felt something tight in my chest. Not disappointment. Not quite. But a kind of tension, like a pulled thread that hadn't snapped yet. By 3, I had talked myself out of everything. It had meant nothing. A look. A handful of brief exchanges. An invented connection on my end. By 5, I knew I was lying. That evening, I stood in front of the window again. Still no glass. Just my fingertips on the frame. The sky was fading into that strange blue that comes before night, not quite dark, not quite light. And then I saw him. Not at the door. Not on the stairs. But across the street, on the other side. He wasn't holding a package. He wasn't wearing the uniform. Just a black t-shirt and jeans. His hair was slightly damp, as if he'd just washed it. He was looking at our building, not at a particular window, just generally, calmly. I didn't wave. I didn't blink. I didn't move. Neither did he. Eventually, he turned and walked away. No package. No destination. That night, as I folded laundry, my husband asked if I was feeling all right. "You've been quiet," he said. I told him I was fine. And I was. I truly was. But the quiet wasn't emptiness anymore. It was a question waiting to be answered. Before I went to bed, I placed the glass back on the sill. Not as a signal. Not as a test. Just a promise to myself that something had begun. Even if I didn't know what. The following days passed in a rhythm both predictable and unbearable. Each one bled into the next, like identical pages in a book I no longer had the will to read. I woke up early, out of habit more than need, moved through the kitchen like a ghost in her own house, and watched my reflection in windows as though waiting for it to become someone else. I didn't see him. Not at 11:15. Not at any other time. Not across the street. Not behind a parcel. He had vanished from the routes I had unknowingly memorized. There was no knock, no buzz, no accidental meeting by the mailbox. I hadn't realized how fully I had come to expect him until he was no longer there. My husband continued as usual. His conversations were about the office, about delayed meetings, about the weather. I responded in kind, with the same distant interest. At night, we lay side by side in the same bed, our bodies inches apart but miles disconnected. The silence between us was never hostile, never loud, it simply settled there, quietly claiming the space like dust. I tried to focus on other things. I reorganized the spice cabinet. I went through old photo albums. I rearranged the living room furniture in a burst of energy that left me exhausted and unsatisfied. None of it worked. The apartment looked different, but nothing inside me had changed. On the fourth day, I left the apartment early and walked through the neighborhood, taking unfamiliar streets on purpose. I bought a coffee from a new place and sat outside, watching strangers pass. I studied their clothes, their postures, their laughter. Everyone seemed to know where they were going. I didn't. Eventually, I wandered into a small second-hand bookshop tucked between a laundromat and a flower shop. It smelled of paper and something older, something comforting. I ran my fingers along the spines without reading the titles. A book fell from the shelf, and I caught it instinctively. It was a thin volume with no cover, only a faded blue-gray binding. I opened it at random and read a sentence that made no real sense but still made me pause. We are only strangers until we choose not to be. I bought the book. I didn't know why. When I came home, the apartment was still. Afternoon light came through the blinds in thin strips. I placed the book on the kitchen table and stared at it. That evening, while I chopped onions for dinner, my husband came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter. "You've been quieter than usual," he said. I nodded but didn't answer right away. The knife in my hand moved methodically. "I'm fine," I said eventually. He studied me. I could feel it, though I didn't look up. After a moment, he said, "You've been cooking more." "Maybe I just want something to do," I replied. There was a pause. He opened the fridge, took out a bottle of water, and left. That night, I opened the window again. Not to place a glass, not to watch for movement, just to feel the air. It was warm and still. The next day, I returned to the bookshop. The same man was behind the counter, older, with silver hair pulled back loosely. "Back for more?" he asked. "I'm not sure what I'm looking for," I admitted. "Most people aren't," he replied, and turned back to his newspaper. I browsed again, not expecting to find anything. And yet, as I rounded the far corner of the shop, there he was. The delivery boy. No parcel, no uniform. Just jeans, a gray hoodie, and that same stillness in his posture. He didn't see me right away. I stood between two shelves, frozen, heart climbing slowly into my throat. When he finally turned and noticed me, there was no surprise in his face. Only recognition. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. I nodded back. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say in that moment. He paid for a book, something thin and worn, and left without looking back. I stood there for several more minutes, pretending to read, but the words never reached me. When I came home that evening, I placed the thin book I'd bought earlier next to the blue-gray one on the table. Then I moved them both to the drawer and closed it. The apartment was quiet. My husband was still at work. The day was ending, slowly bleeding into night. I made dinner without appetite. When my husband came home, he looked tired. I asked how his day had been, and he gave the usual answer. He sat beside me at the table, eating in silence. Halfway through the meal, he reached across and touched my wrist. Not a grip, just a light, lingering touch. "I know something's different," he said. "I don't know what. But I feel it." I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw the years in his face. The gentleness, the uncertainty. The effort. "I'm just trying to understand myself," I said. He nodded slowly. Okay. That night, I lay awake while he slept. I turned onto my side and studied his profile in the faint light from the hallway. I remembered the early years, the excitement, the long conversations, the inside jokes. The laughter that came easily. I wondered if it was possible to return to that place, or if the version of me who had laughed like that no longer existed. I wasn't thinking of the delivery boy. Not directly. I was thinking about how something small, an interaction, a look, a presence, could unravel the version of yourself you'd worn for years like skin. I wasn't trying to undo anything. I wasn't looking to destroy. I just wanted to feel awake again. The next morning, I stood by the window without the glass in my hand. The sill was empty. And yet, I waited. The following morning unfolded with the same quiet rhythm I had grown accustomed to, but there was a tension beneath it now, like the taut surface of water before a stone breaks it. I lingered in bed longer than usual, not out of tiredness but uncertainty. There was nothing waiting for me outside the blankets, nothing pressing or urgent. Still, I rose, performed my ritual, made the bed, brewed the tea, washed the same 2 cups, wiped the counter. Each motion grounded me. Each one reminded me that this day was mine to shape, even if I didn't know how. I thought about returning to the bookstore, but I couldn't decide whether I wanted to see him again or avoid the possibility entirely. The encounter from yesterday hadn't left me shaken, it had left me open. Like something had been unzipped. And now I didn't know how to fasten myself back together. Instead, I walked to the corner bakery I hadn't visited in years. The owner had changed, the menu had modernized, but the smell, fresh dough, coffee, burnt sugar, was the same. I sat by the window and watched people move with intention. Young couples with matching headphones, elderly women pulling carts behind them, children in uniforms with undone buttons. I sat for nearly an hour, slowly tearing off pieces of a croissant I barely tasted. No one noticed me. That was both comforting and devastating. When I returned home, the apartment was quiet, as expected. I opened the windows to let in some air and then wandered into the living room, drawn to the books I hadn't touched in years. I pulled out a few from the shelf, ran my hand across old pages, read the first sentences of forgotten stories. Eventually, I found myself in front of the mirror in the hallway again. I didn't know what I was looking for. Signs of age? Guilt? Change? Maybe I wanted to confirm that something had shifted in me, something irreversible. But the reflection offered no answers. I stepped closer. My face looked calm. Tired, yes, but not broken. There was no drama in my expression. Just a deep, persistent question behind the eyes. The phone rang, startling me. I answered out of instinct. It was my husband. He asked if I needed anything from the store on his way home. I said no. He told me he might be a little late, there was an unexpected meeting. I told him that was fine. After we hung up, I stood in the silence, holding the receiver a little longer than necessary. Then I returned it to its cradle and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the spot where the glass of water had always stood. I hadn't placed it there for days now. Still, I felt its imprint, like a phantom limb. It was almost noon when I heard a knock. Not a buzz. A knock. That alone was enough to send a tremor through my spine. I rose slowly and opened the door. He stood there. Not in uniform, not with a parcel, just himself. Same quiet posture, same unreadable gaze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I stepped aside. He didn't move. I didn't insist. I was nearby, he said. I nodded. You always are. He offered the faintest smile, more like a movement than an emotion, and then glanced past me into the apartment. Not searching, just observing. I wasn't sure if you'd be here, he said. I live here. I know. I waited. He didn't explain further, and I didn't press him. It wasn't like the scenes I had imagined in my head. There was no spark, no music, no clear moment of realization. Just this quiet awareness that the boundary had shifted again. I should go, he said, finally. Okay, I answered. He turned, descended the stairs, and disappeared from view. I closed the door, leaned against it for a moment, and exhaled slowly. I wasn't disappointed. I wasn't relieved either. The moment had happened. That was enough. That evening, my husband returned home on time after all. We ate together. He told me about the meeting. I asked questions, nodded in the right places. After dinner, he brought out an old photo album. I was surprised, he rarely did that. Do you remember this trip? He asked, pointing to a picture of us in a vineyard. Yes, I said. It was hot that day. You kept fanning me with a menu. He laughed. And you spilled red wine all over my white shirt. We both smiled. It wasn't forced. It wasn't nostalgic. It was just small. Human. I asked him why he brought the album out. I don't know, he said. I guess I just miss us sometimes. That sentence lingered. I didn't reply. Later, after he had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room and looked through more pages. We had been so young. And yet, even in those photos, I could already see the cracks beginning. I closed the album and set it aside. Then I opened the drawer and took out the small, blue-gray book I had bought from the store. I flipped through its pages until I found the line I'd read that first day. We are only strangers until we choose not to be. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind moved slowly, like the tide pulling back. I wasn't thinking about the boy, not in a romantic way. I was thinking about what he had interrupted. What he had made me confront. My life wasn't broken. My marriage wasn't failing. But something was missing. Something essential. Not drama. Not passion. Just presence. And I couldn't ignore that anymore. By morning, I still hadn't decided what I would do. But I opened the window, just a little, and let the air in. The morning began like any other, with the faint sound of city life filtering through the thin bedroom curtains. The soft humming of a distant lawnmower, a dog barking 2 buildings over, and the slow creak of plumbing pipes expanding with hot water. My husband had already left for work, his side of the bed was cool, the sheets neatly folded back as always. He had a habit of making the bed behind him, even if I was still in it. I lay there for a while, not asleep, not quite awake, letting the weight of the silence settle around me. It wasn't heavy. Just constant. Familiar. The kind of silence that feels like wallpaper, always there, unnoticed until you really stare at it. Eventually, I swung my legs over the side and stood, the wooden floor cool against my feet. I moved through the kitchen slowly, boiling water, setting out the mug, slicing a piece of bread. The rituals never changed. They were the bones of my day, even when everything else felt uncertain. The glass was already on the windowsill. I hadn't placed it there that morning, but I must have the day before and forgotten to bring it in. The condensation had long since evaporated, leaving behind faint mineral rings on the surface of the glass. A ghost of water. A ghost of intention. I stood there for a while, watching the street below. Cars moved, people passed, but none of them were him. I wasn't sure what I had expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. The knock came unexpectedly. Not at the usual time. Not with any warning. It wasn't the buzzer, it was a quiet, almost hesitant knock at the door, like someone unsure whether they had the right address. I paused for a moment, then walked slowly to the door and opened it. He was there again. Dressed simply, a backpack over one shoulder. No package in hand. No reason to be here. He looked different this time, not younger or older, just more real. As if the distance I had placed between us had dissolved. "Hi," I said. He nodded, a soft acknowledgement. He didn't step forward. Neither did I. "I was in the neighborhood," he said. "I figured," I replied. There was a long silence. Not tense, just uncertain. We had reached the limits of small talk, but there was still something suspended between us. He looked past me, into the apartment again. I could feel the warmth of his gaze, not intrusive, just curious. "You look different," he said quietly. I didn't ask what he meant. Maybe he couldn't explain it. Maybe I already knew. There was nothing flirtatious in his voice. Nothing overt. Just observation. "I've been thinking," I said after a moment, not entirely sure where the words were going. "About a lot of things." He waited. Sometimes I don't know whether I miss what I had, or if I just miss feeling like someone saw me. He nodded again. "That makes sense." And that was it. No declarations. No confessions. Just a quiet moment in the doorway, two people standing on either side of something invisible. Before he turned to go, he said, "I'm leaving this job soon. I won't be around the area anymore." I didn't react immediately. My fingers gripped the edge of the doorframe lightly, grounding me. "Oh," I said, after a pause. He gave me one last look, not searching, not sad. Just still. Then he turned and walked away. I didn't close the door for a while. The hallway was quiet. The sound of his footsteps faded quickly. When I finally shut it, the air inside felt heavier. Not painful. Just full. Like something had settled. I didn't cry. I didn't feel loss in the traditional sense. What we'd had wasn't something that could be named. It wasn't an affair. It wasn't a friendship. It was a mirror, held up for just long enough to remind me I was still capable of being seen. Later that day, I busied myself with cleaning. Not out of necessity, but because I needed movement. I took everything off the shelves, dusted, reorganized. I even pulled furniture away from walls I hadn't touched in years. Found a forgotten earring, a receipt from a restaurant I didn't remember visiting. In the back of the closet, I found a pair of shoes I hadn't worn since our anniversary trip 5 years ago. I tried them on. They still fit, but I didn't feel like the woman who had chosen them. That evening, my husband came home earlier than expected. He brought flowers. Not roses. Not anything with meaning. Just a simple, practical bouquet from the supermarket. He placed them on the table without a word. We ate dinner quietly. I asked him about his day, and he answered. He asked if I'd done anything special. I said no. After dinner, we sat together on the couch, watching the news. His hand found mine midway through the broadcast. I let it stay there. When the program ended, he turned to me and said, "Do you ever feel like we're just coexisting?" I was surprised by the question, but not by the sentiment. "Yes," I said. "Sometimes." He nodded. "I think I miss talking to you. Really talking. I miss that too." We didn't say more that night. But something had shifted, however slightly. Before going to bed, I walked to the window and removed the glass from the sill. I washed it, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet. Not out of regret. Not out of shame. simply because that chapter, whatever it had been, was now closed. And in its place, there was space for something else to begin. The days that followed fell into an odd rhythm, calmer, almost hollow, like an echo of something that had already ended. I moved through each one as though on autopilot, brushing my teeth, folding laundry, replying to emails I didn't care about, and preparing meals with hands that barely registered the textures of what they touched. But beneath the surface, something was settling. Something quiet and firm and deeply unfamiliar. I no longer looked for him. That realization came slowly, like a dawn you don't notice until you realize you haven't turned the light on. I stopped glancing at the clock at 11:15. I stopped scanning the street. I no longer reached for the window in the morning. That small glass of water, so innocent in appearance, had held a world of intention, longing, and questions. But now it was just a memory. The clarity came in fragments. Not in revelations, not in one clean moment, but in smaller things. Like when I opened a drawer and found the delivery slips I used to keep tucked away, each signed with my name in hurried ink. Or when I passed a bus stop and realized my heart no longer reacted at the thought of seeing him standing there. It wasn't grief I felt. It wasn't even regret. It was space. I began spending more time outside the apartment. Nothing dramatic, just small excursions. I visited markets I hadn't walked through in years, not with any purpose, but for the simple pleasure of noise and movement. I watched people bargain, laugh, argue. I watched children lose their parents in the crowd and find them again seconds later. I observed the world not as someone who wanted to be part of it, but as someone who finally remembered it existed. At a small corner bookstore, not the one where I had first seen him again, but a new one, I purchased a journal. Plain cover. No lines. The pages were thick and inviting. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a single sentence. I don't know who I am when no one is looking. I stared at the words for a long time. They didn't scare me. They didn't shame me. They just felt true. The next day, my husband asked if I wanted to go out for dinner. He said it casually, as though it had always been part of our routine. But it hadn't been. Not for months. Maybe years. I said yes. We went to a small place near the canal, a restaurant we used to visit when we first moved into the city. The same couple still owned it. The decor hadn't changed. The chairs were still too small, the lighting still too dim, but the familiarity made it warmer than I expected. We didn't talk much during the meal, but the silence was different now. Not heavy. Just present. He commented on the food. I told him about the bookstore. He listened. I noticed how often he looked at me, not out of suspicion or detachment, but with genuine effort. It was subtle. But it was there. At one point, he reached across the table and touched the back of my hand lightly. I didn't pull away. I didn't flinch. I didn't feel guilty. On the way home, we walked slowly. The city had a softness at night that always surprised me, as though the buildings exhaled once the crowds disappeared. When we reached the corner near our apartment, I stopped for a moment and looked up at the window, our window. There was no glass on the sill. And yet I still saw it. The shadow of what it had meant. The weight it once carried. But also, the absence of that weight now. Back inside, my husband made tea. He placed the cup in front of me without a word. I thanked him. We both sat at the table, each sipping slowly. I noticed the way the steam curled upward, catching the light. After he went to bed, I stayed in the living room. I opened the journal again. This time I wrote more. Not paragraphs. Just thoughts. Words that had been stuck somewhere beneath the surface, finally rising. I didn't mention the delivery boy. I didn't need to. That chapter wasn't erased, it was simply integrated. A part of my life that didn't need to define me, but had helped me find something I hadn't known was lost. The next morning, I woke early. The sky was pale, the color of cold milk. I opened the window slightly and let the air in. It was cooler than expected. I stood there for a while, arms folded, watching the street below wake up. Later that afternoon, my husband texted me from work. "Let's go away this weekend. Just us." It was the kind of message I used to dream of. Now, I read it with a strange calmness. No butterflies. No confusion. Just the quiet hum of possibility. I replied, "Okay." He responded with a thumbs-up emoji. It made me smile. I spent the rest of the day preparing for the trip. Just the basics: clothes, a book, toiletries. But I noticed how careful I was with each item. As if choosing which version of myself I wanted to bring with me. That evening, I opened the journal again and wrote, "I'm still here. And I'm still learning how to be." When I closed the book, I felt something settle inside me. Not resolve. Not clarity. But steadiness. Before going to bed, I checked the windows, turned off the lights, and stood in the hallway for a moment, looking down its length. It had always seemed so narrow to me before, like a tunnel leading only back to what I had already lived. But now it felt different. Not wider. Not brighter. Just open. Just real. I turned off the last light and walked to bed. That night, for the first time in a long time, I slept without dreaming. We spent the night together. There is no simpler way to say it. No embellishment. No poetry. Just the bare truth of what happened. And yet, even as I write those words, I feel them settling not like stones but like soft cloth, gentle, layered, complex. There was nothing reckless in it. Nothing sudden. It didn't erupt like a storm or blaze like fire. It unfolded, quiet and sure, like rain that had been gathering in the sky for weeks and finally fell because it could no longer be held back. It happened on a Thursday. He had texted earlier that afternoon. I still don't know how he had my number. Maybe I gave it to him at some point and forgot. Or maybe he had found it by accident, on a delivery label, a contact form. The point is, the message arrived without warning and without fanfare. "Would you like to meet?" Not for long. Just to talk. My first instinct was to ignore it. Not out of fear. Not even guilt. But because I wasn't sure what I had left to say. What could talking change now? But the day moved forward, slow and dense, and I found myself glancing at the message again, and then again. Not rereading the words, just feeling their presence. Their weight. By late afternoon, I had replied with a single word, "Where?" He suggested a park near the edge of the city, one neither of us lived near. Neutral ground. Open space. Anonymity in plain sight. I arrived early. Sat on a bench under a row of quiet trees. The late sun filtered through the leaves, painting shadows across the pavement. People walked by, but no one paid attention to me. I was invisible again, and for once it felt like relief. When he appeared, he didn't approach immediately. I saw him pause at a distance, scan the park, notice me. He took his time walking over. I appreciated that. He sat beside me. Not close, not far. Just near enough. We talked. Not about us. Not at first. About work. His new job. The city. The weather. It wasn't awkward. Just cautious. Like two people testing the temperature of water before stepping in. Eventually, the conversation shifted, as I knew it would. He said something about the way I had looked at him that first time. I said something about needing to feel visible. We both admitted things that neither of us had planned to say. And then, when there was nothing left to untangle, he asked quietly if I wanted to go somewhere else. There was no pressure in his voice. No urgency. Just the question, placed gently between us like a coin on a table. I nodded. We found a small hotel on a quiet street. I don't remember its name. The woman at the desk barely looked at us. We paid in cash. The room was simple. Not cheap, not luxurious. A bed. A window. A chair. A small lamp with a frayed shade. It didn't feel like a setting for anything dramatic. It felt like a pause in the world. We didn't speak much after that. We didn't need to. Every motion was deliberate. Every glance filled in what words couldn't. There was no confusion. No rush. And then, we spent the night together. It wasn't about escape. It wasn't about revenge or validation. It wasn't even about him. It was about me. About reclaiming something I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. When I woke the next morning, light was already pressing through the curtain. He was sitting in the chair by the window, fully dressed, gazing out at the empty street. Neither of us said anything for a long time. The silence was not awkward. It was soft. Settled. Eventually, I sat up, pulled the blanket around me, and looked at him. He turned, met my eyes, and nodded. That was enough. I dressed slowly. He didn't watch. I appreciated that, too. When we were both ready, we left the room together. Walked down the narrow hallway. Stepped outside into the clean morning air. He looked at me once more before we parted ways at the corner. Not with expectation. Not with longing. Just with recognition. The kind of look people exchange when something has been shared that cannot be returned to its original form. I took the train home. The ride was quiet, the car nearly empty. I stared at my reflection in the window, noticing how I looked more rested than I had in weeks. Not younger. Not lighter. But complete. Back at the apartment, everything was as I had left it. The bed still made. The dishes clean. The plant on the windowsill drooping slightly, thirsty. I watered it. Took a long shower. Dressed in fresh clothes. When my husband came home, he kissed me on the cheek. Told me about his day. Asked if I'd remembered to return a call from the dry cleaner. I said I had. We ate dinner together. Watched a bit of television. Exchanged pleasantries. Fell into the familiar rhythm. But I felt the difference. Inside me, something had shifted. Something had returned. That night, when he reached for me in bed, I didn't turn away. I didn't lean in either. I just remained still, allowing the silence to fill the space between our bodies. I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel regret. What I felt was presence. That night was not an ending. It was not a betrayal I planned to confess or a secret I intended to carry like a wound. It was an interruption. A moment of breath between long-held poses. It was something I had needed. And now, it was something I would live beyond. The days after that night unfolded with an unfamiliar stillness, not heavy or burdened, but quiet in a way that made space for something new to enter. I didn't wake up gasping with panic or guilt. I didn't flinch when my husband passed behind me in the kitchen or when his hand brushed mine at the dinner table. Nothing around me had changed, but I had. The most surprising part was how ordinary it all felt. I moved through the week like someone adjusting to a slightly different tempo of music. The rhythm was the same, but the pauses lingered longer, and the chords resonated in deeper places. I went about my errands, kept the apartment in order, answered texts from acquaintances with just enough warmth to pass for sincerity. My routines continued, but I was more aware of them now, as though I had pulled slightly back from the surface of my life and could finally see it clearly. On Tuesday, I returned to the grocery store we had always used. I took my time selecting items, moving slowly through the aisles. I noticed things I hadn't before, the way the cashier always double-bagged the heavy bottles, the way the man in front of me tapped his card 3 times against the reader even though once would have been enough. Small, human things that I had once filtered out. When I reached home and unpacked the bags, I found that I had purchased a jar of orange marmalade. I hadn't eaten marmalade in years. My mother used to buy it when I was a child, spreading it thinly on toast and calling it her sunshine jam. I stared at the jar for a long moment before placing it carefully on the top shelf of the pantry. That evening, my husband came home later than usual. He apologized for the delay, set down his keys, and leaned against the counter as I stirred a pot of soup. "Long day," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I can tell," I replied without looking up. He didn't ask what I'd done with my day. He hadn't in a while. I didn't resent it anymore. I simply noted it. After dinner, we watched a documentary about a woman who had restored old houses in forgotten towns. I found myself drawn to her face, her hands, the way she touched broken wood as if it had feelings. My husband commented on the architecture. I said little. At night, I lay awake listening to the sounds of our building, the elevator cables groaning, water rushing through unseen pipes, the occasional door clicking shut down the hallway. The world continued. I let it. By Friday, something inside me began to feel restless, not in a dramatic way, but with a subtle itch I couldn't quite locate. I found myself standing in front of the hallway mirror more often, not to inspect my appearance, but to check for signs of something. A flicker in my eyes, perhaps. A shift in posture. Proof that I hadn't imagined the transformation I felt. It wasn't about beauty. It wasn't about youth. It was about presence. That afternoon, I walked to the bookstore again. Not the first one. The second. The one where I had found the blank journal and written my first unsure sentence. I wandered through the shelves without aim. Eventually, I found myself in the back corner, staring at a display of travel essays. I pulled one out, open to the middle, and read a passage about a woman in her 50s who had taken a solo train journey across 4 countries. She didn't know the language. She didn't know the customs. She got lost more often than not. But each misstep became a breadcrumb, leading her deeper into herself. I closed the book and carried it to the register. Back at home, I brewed a cup of tea and sat by the window. I hadn't sat there in weeks. The sill was empty. Clean. The absence of the glass had become its own symbol. As I read, the city moved around me, soft and indifferent. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. That was the difference. Later that evening, my husband mentioned that he was thinking of taking some time off work. He said he felt burned out. He talked about maybe renting a place outside the city for a weekend, something simple. A cabin or a cottage. I nodded, told him it sounded like a good idea. He asked if I'd come with him. I paused, then said yes. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted from him. From us. From any of it. But I did know that I no longer wanted to live by default. Agreeing to the trip wasn't about hope or obligation. It was about movement. That night, as he slept, I stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time, watching him breathe. His chest rose and fell with a familiar rhythm. He looked peaceful. Tired. Human. I thought about the years we had shared. The seasons we had passed through together. The quiet mornings. The polite arguments. The long vacations that had felt too short. The dinners that had stretched into silence. We had survived so much. But surviving wasn't the same as living. Still, he was trying now. I could feel it. Not perfectly. Not easily. But with sincerity. And that mattered. Before I turned off the light, I walked to my desk and opened the journal again. I hadn't written in days. I stared at the blank page and then wrote. I no longer need to be found. I've stopped hiding. The pen trembled slightly in my hand, not from nerves, but from the realization that I meant it. I closed the book and set it aside. The weekend was approaching. We had no plans yet. No directions. Just the idea of going. And for once, that felt like enough. When I finally climbed into bed, I didn't think of the past. I didn't reach for memories or guilt or longing. I let the present settle over me like a quiet blanket. The last thing I heard before sleep was the sound of my husband shifting slightly beside me, his arm brushing mine. And I didn't move away. We left early Saturday morning, our suitcases packed the night before with quiet efficiency. There was no discussion about what to bring. No checklist. No tension. We moved around each other in the bedroom like people who had known each other long enough to predict every reach, every glance. In another time, I might have mistaken that for harmony. Now I knew it was simply familiarity. The car ride was long but gentle. He drove without music, his hands steady on the wheel. I watched the landscape change through the passenger window, the gray blur of the city softening into fields, then trees, then hills that seemed to breathe as they rose and fell. We spoke occasionally, lightly, about the scenery, about the small towns we passed. Nothing deep. Nothing probing. The silence between our words wasn't strained. It was suspended. Like we were both waiting to see where this journey would take us, beyond just the coordinates. We arrived at the cottage around midday. It was smaller than expected, tucked between two sloping hills, surrounded by trees that moved only when the wind insisted. A gravel path led to the door. A chipped wooden bench sat just outside, weather-worn and waiting. Inside, the space was simple. One bedroom. A narrow kitchen. A fireplace with ashes from someone else's past visit. The air was cold at first, and we moved without speaking to open windows and unpack our things. I placed my journal on the bedside table without thinking. Later, while he read by the window, I walked outside and wandered to the edge of the property. There was a path leading downward, disappearing into trees. I didn't follow it, but I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind, the rustling leaves, the occasional bird startled into flight. The quiet here was different. Not the kind that hovered awkwardly in rooms or clung to tired marriages. It was full. Alive. It allowed me to hear myself more clearly. When I returned to the cottage, he was still in the same chair, his book open but unread. He looked up and smiled, not the smile of someone trying to fix anything, but one that acknowledged the present for what it was. We made dinner together. Something simple, boiled potatoes, grilled vegetables, a bottle of wine we had brought with us. The kitchen was too small for two, so we kept bumping into each other. Once, his hand brushed my back. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in either. I just let it happen. We ate outside on the bench, our plates balanced on our laps. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting the landscape in a soft gold that made everything look like it belonged in a memory. At one point, I asked, "Do you think we're still the same people?" He didn't answer right away. He stared at the sky, then said, "No. But maybe that's okay." That night, the fireplace crackled softly as we sat on the rug. He poured us each a second glass of wine. We didn't toast. We didn't talk. We just sipped and let the silence take up space. I noticed how the lines around his eyes had deepened, how his hands looked more worn than I remembered. But I also noticed how he watched the fire, really watched it, as though it held answers. Before bed, I stepped outside one more time. The air had cooled. The stars were brighter here. I wrapped my arms around myself and tilted my head back, feeling both impossibly small and oddly grounded. When I returned inside, he was already under the covers, reading with the lamp turned low. He looked at me but didn't speak. I turned off the light and climbed in beside him. He didn't reach for me. Neither did I. We slept back to back, but not out of distance. More like mutual respect for space. In the morning, I woke early. The house was quiet, bathed in blue-gray light. I made tea and sat by the window with my journal. I opened it and reread my last entry. I no longer need to be found. I've stopped hiding. Below it, I wrote. But I'm still learning how to stay visible, to myself. I watched him sleep for a while after that, the slow rise and fall of his chest, the way his face softened in rest. He looked peaceful. Not happy. Not sad. Just at rest. I wondered how often I had really looked at him this way in the last 10 years. Not through the lens of routine or responsibility, but simply as a man. As someone who had stayed. He stirred as I stood to leave the room. I heard him mumble my name, just once, half asleep. I paused. Then let him be. We spent most of the day walking. The path I had seen from the day before led us through quiet woods and up a shallow hill where the trees opened into a small meadow. We sat on a fallen log, shared a bag of crackers we had packed, and watched a fox dart through the underbrush. He pointed it out. I smiled. On the way back, he reached for my hand. I let him hold it. That evening, as we packed our bags to return home, he said quietly, "This was good for us." I nodded. Yes. He hesitated, then asked, "Do you think we can keep trying?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted the words to matter. "I think we already are," I said. He looked at me with something like relief. Or maybe just quiet understanding. That night, back in our apartment, everything felt smaller. The rooms. The sounds. The air. But not in a bad way. Just more contained. More known. I placed my journal back on the shelf. I didn't need it tonight. And when we finally lay in bed, I turned toward him. Not out of obligation. But because I wanted to. The first Monday after we returned from the cottage felt different, though not because anything had changed on the surface. My husband left for work at the usual time. The streets outside our window hummed with the same rhythm. I stood at the kitchen counter with my mug of tea, watching the light shift across the tiles. But inside, the air felt cleared somehow, like someone had finally opened a door in a long-sealed room. There was no grand transformation. No burst of energy. No emotional high. Just a slow, grounded steadiness. I moved through the apartment not to fill the hours but because I wanted to care for the space again. I wiped counters with intention. I organized drawers not out of boredom but because they were mine. I didn't rush. I didn't delay. I simply moved. Mid-morning, I sat down with my journal for the first time since the trip and wrote without stopping. I no longer feel invisible. Not because someone looked at me, but because I finally did. The sentence landed quietly on the page, but I felt its truth all the way through my chest. I sat with it for a long while before closing the book and returning it to the shelf. In the afternoon, I went for a walk through the neighborhood, not for exercise or errands, but because I wanted to be outside. I wandered into shops I hadn't visited in years. Bought a bar of lavender soap from a small apothecary. Stopped to watch a street performer play violin outside the train station. No one was in a rush. Not even me. At one point, I passed the building where the first bookstore had been, the place I'd gone in hopes of seeing him again. It was closed now, a metal grate drawn across the front. A small sign in the window said they'd moved to a new location. I didn't feel anything dramatic. No surge of emotion. Just a quiet acknowledgement, like passing the shell of a place that once held meaning. I stood there for a minute, then turned and walked on. Back home, I rearranged the bookshelf in the living room. Not alphabetically, not by genre, just by feel. What books I wanted close. What stories still spoke to me. What voices I was ready to let go of. I paused over the blue-gray one I'd bought so long ago. The one that had seemed to appear at exactly the right time. I opened to the same line I'd read before. We are only strangers until we choose not to be. I closed the book and smiled. I placed it on the very top shelf, not to forget it, but to honor the space it had held. That evening, when my husband returned home, he brought groceries without asking. Nothing fancy, just the ingredients for a simple stir-fry we used to make years ago. We cooked together, brushing past each other in the small kitchen. There was a new ease between us. Not romantic. Not passionate. But respectful. Curious. Over dinner, he asked if I'd be interested in joining him at a work event later in the week. I hadn't gone with him to one in years. I agreed before I even thought about it. Later, as we washed dishes side by side, he turned to me and said, "I like being around you lately." It was a simple thing. An unpolished thing. But it was real. I nodded. I like being around me too. We both laughed, softly, and continued with the task at hand. Afterwards, I stepped out onto the small balcony while he answered emails in the other room. The air was cool against my skin. The sky was just beginning to lose its light. I leaned against the railing and watched people below pass through their own evenings, bags of takeout in hand, children tugging at their arms, teenagers with earbuds, heads down and shoulders hunched against nothing in particular. I didn't envy them. I didn't compare. I simply observed. A few minutes later, I went back inside, changed into a long shirt, and sat on the edge of the bed. I looked around the room. Our room. The creased pillows, the small lamp, the slightly crooked painting he insisted on hanging himself. All the imperfections of a shared space. A life built not from grand gestures, but from thousands of small, repeated ones. There had been a moment, weeks ago, when I would have said I didn't recognize myself anymore. But now, I knew the truth, I had never stopped being me. I had only stopped listening. The delivery boy was gone. I hadn't seen him since the day we parted. I didn't expect to. There were no fantasies, no questions left. He had entered my life like a match, brief, bright, and meant to ignite something I couldn't start on my own. He wasn't the destination. He was the spark. I wouldn't rewrite that chapter. I wouldn't carry it like a secret or parade it like a badge. I would simply let it exist, fully, quietly, without shame. My husband came into the room then, smiling at something on his phone. He looked at me, a little surprised by the stillness on my face, and asked if I was tired. "No," I said. "Just thinking." He nodded and started brushing his teeth. I lay back on the bed, pulled the blanket to my chest, and listened to the water run from the tap. Before I turned off the light, I whispered something I hadn't said aloud in a very long time. I'm glad I stayed. Not for him. Not even for us. But for me.